Let's look at some non-religious movements to try to improve society. These are mostly going to be conducted by women. Now, remember I had mentioned way back in the Second Great Awakening that women particularly were infused with this idea that they had a religious obligation to make the world a better place. Well, they're going to do it, and that's going to result in the reform movements of this period, of the 1830s, 40s, 50s. One of the key beliefs of the Second Great Awakening is that everyone can be saved, that everyone has divine light within them. Well, that really changes how we see the world, because then all of a sudden a criminal isn't just a dirty, worthless criminal to be discarded. This is somebody who could potentially be saved. Or you could say the same thing about people who have maybe mental disease or alcoholism. And so the world stops being divided into kind of the good people and the bad people, and it begins to be seen as people who are potentially can be saved. So we have we have an evangelical Protestant crusade against personal immorality. The main cause of crime and disorder, of course, is alcohol. It's the main cause of violence, poverty, infidelity, domestic abuse, and women ending up single moms. It's probably the main cause of bankruptcy during the period as well. Drunkenness was associated with the hated immigrants. Although, ironically, the immigrants don't appear to have drank any more than the Americans who were born here, the white Americans who were born here. But they get stigmatized with this idea that they're a bunch of drunks. 500,000 Americans will sign a petition to give up hard liquor in 1840. And major organizations begin to be launched calling for the making illegal of alcohol. Now, I'm going to show this in class, so if you're in my class, don't worry about this, but if you want to pause it and look at this is a great picture here. And we'll pick up this movement towards prohibition, or temperance as it's called, as we move along. There's also new movements in health and science. Cholera epidemics, which come from bad water, will lead to a lot of deaths in the 1830s and 40s, and lead to calls for public health systems. You had a more than a 50% chance of dying if you got cholera. And in 1833, for example, about a quarter of the city of New Orleans died of cholera in that 1 year. Nobody understood bacteria, so they didn't understand that there was actually a living organism getting into you in the form of bacteria. And so people would run away if people began dying of cholera. The rich would leave the area and go to health spas for the water cure, which is alternating hot and cold baths. A man named Sylvester Graham prescribed a diet of fruits, vegetables, and coarse ground grains, and invented the graham cracker as part of this diet. This was a health movement at the time. Phrenology is the idea that you can tell everything about a person by the shape of their skull. This actually comes from Germany in the 1830s. And this tells you someone's intelligence, their skills, their character. Are they a good person, bad person, honest, dishonest? And they began to use this to determine professions. They were measuring kids' skulls and deciding if they would go to college and what type of job they would do as an adult. And this was seen as a huge improvement over the market system, where people just went out and competed for jobs. And people believed this. People completely accepted the notion of phrenology in the 1830s and 1840s. A little embarrassing now, but there it is. Medicine generally was unregulated. There was no licensing to become a doctor. Anybody could just throw out a shingle and call themselves a doctor. And so a lot of doctors were completely uneducated, completely insane, or both. They were called quacks if they were kind of nutty. There was an attempt to license doctors, but this was rejected as undemocratic in limiting the access of common people to medicine, as it would have caused medical care to become more expensive. There is no broad theory of disease or infection. Vaccinations are used, but nobody understands them. Vaccinations become popular through Edward Jenner in the 18th century. And that's where you injected a little bit of a disease into someone to make them immune to it. But again, nobody knew why it worked. They just observed that it did work. William Morton in the middle 1800s will become the first person to use anesthesia for dentistry. And he's using laughing gas, so he gives patients laughing gas so they don't hurt when he does the dentistry to them. They also use laughing gas, incidentally, for fun. He would have parties where everybody would come over and breathe the laughing gas. Eventually, this spreads to surgery, and for the first time, you can get medical procedures where you don't necessarily feel the intense pain from those. But the rejection of science by doctors stifles progress. Doctors had their traditional ways of doing things, and they weren't really interested in these new scientific approaches. Although Oliver Wendell Holmes, who I mentioned earlier in environmentalism, develops the first theory of contagion in 1843, the idea that disease spreads from one person to another. Another area that gets reformed is education. In 1830, there's not a single state in the Union that has a universal public education system. Massachusetts establishes a state board of education to educate its kids and appoints Horace Mann to be its first leader. He argues that education is vital to democracy, that if we're dumb, we're going to make bad decisions when we vote. That's his argument. He lengthens the school year to 6 whole months. It had been shorter than that before. He doubles teachers' salary. He broadens the subjects taught in school. He establishes professional training for teachers. And Massachusetts will become the first state to have really quality public education. Now, if you lived out west, you probably had no school available to you. And if you did, the teacher might be illiterate. In the South, only about a third of white kids and no black kids were enrolled in school, while in the North, 72% were enrolled. But attendance was unreliable. Kids would stay home if they needed to help on the farm or something like that. And it wasn't mandatory. You weren't required by law to go. They also taught values. They taught you thrift, order, discipline, respect, punctuality, and respect for authority. They were trying to create citizens and employees, not scholars. There wasn't a real focus on intellectual pursuits. Education was seen as a key to reforming the Native Americans and turning them into civilized men. Most Native Americans were never schooled, but by 1860, 94% of the North, 83% of the white South, and 58% of the country at large is literate, can read and write, which is among the highest rates of literacy in the entire world at that time.